Whew, nothing like a run up to stage to get the blood flowing in the morning. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm Rebekah Brown from Rapid 7. And today we're going to talk about the art and science of threat intelligence. I love being able to speak after Lauren because she talks about the power of story and how it can reach out to people and convey messages and have lasting impacts. And that's really what we need more of in security. We need to be able to tell the story of threats. We need to be able to provide information to people on how they need to respond. And we need to let them know how important it is. What's the impact? How bad could it be? And threat intelligence is what allows us to do that. Threat intelligence bridges worlds when it comes to security. It relies on information on networks. You have to have a technical understanding how networks work, how do attacks work, how do we find this information, how do we pull out these technical details. But it also pulls from a lot of other disciplines as well. It pulls from criminology, from geopolitics, which are becoming more and more relevant to cyber threat intelligence these days. It pulls from linguistics, even psychology. So integrating all of these different disciplines with network security is not an easy task. But it's something that allows us to tell the stories of attacks. It allows us to tell people what's important, how something might affect them, and allow them to make decisions based on that information. It's not an easy task, and the goal of this next 40 minutes is not to make you all experts in threat intelligence. It's to help you kind of reframe how you think about it. A lot of people have kind of misconceptions around what threat intelligence is and how it supports security operations and even what is involved with creating threat intelligence. So I'm going to provide some background, some information on the theory of how all these disciplines pull together to help us make decisions about securing our networks. I'm going to provide some information onto the analytic process so that way you have a better understanding when somebody tells you something that's based on threat intelligence, how they came to those conclusions. And then because I don't like to only exist in the theoretical world, I like to provide some information on how do you actually do this. If you're tasked with threat intelligence, or if you're just curious as to how it works, or if you want to understand better how somebody else might have come to these conclusions that they did, there's some ways that you can do that that don't involve a huge investment or a huge amount of time. So, who am I? I am Rebekah Brown, PDX Beck on Twitter. PDX is the airport code from Portland, Oregon, which is where I'm from. I'm not sure how many of you have seen the TV show Portlandia, but if you have, you basically know everything about my life. We drink hemp milk lattes and ride bicycles and name our pet chickens. But I love Portland. It's a great place to live. My career started out rather strangely. I did not start out in cybersecurity. I did not even start out working with computers. I was a cryptologic linguist with a focus on international relations. And back in the early 2000s when I started working, that meant I was focused a lot on policies, trade, kind of the subtle relationships between the United States and Asian countries. And then things took a sharp turn in about 2005 when we realized that underflowing all of these policy talks and trade relations and economic discussions were cyber actions. There was this kind of under-the-radar war going on between networks that no one really understood how they worked and what it meant and what could possibly be going on. So I was thrown into a bunch of computer science classes. My very first post-high school computer class was network Linux Plus administration, so that was fun. But I had to learn how to take everything I learned before about international relations and apply it to network security. 10 years later, I feel like I've kind of got it down. I am one of the authors of the SAN Cyber Threat Intelligence course, and I teach it as well. And the goal of that class is to help people shorten the time it takes them to go from a world where they view intelligence operations and international politics and relations and network security as two different things and merge them together. And that's kind of a 5-day intense course, but you all look really smart, so I think we can go over all of that content in the next 40 minutes, and you guys will be good to go. So what is cyber threat intelligence exactly? I've seen a lot of different definitions. Some of them are rather long, but the one I like is this. It is analyzed information about the intent, capability, and opportunity of actors in cyberspace. So there's a couple important things about that. First is that it's analyzed information. It's not just data. A lot of the stuff we see that's portrayed as threat intelligence is data, and I'm going to talk about how we get from that data to the actual intelligence. But the other important part is the intent, opportunity, and capability. That gives us our threat spectrum. When we have all three of these things, when we have a hostile intent, when we know that that person, that actor with the intent has a capability, and we know there's an opportunity for them to use it, we end up in the center with a true threat. Now, even if we don't have all three of these, it still lives on the threat spectrum. The most dangerous, I would think, is when we have an opportunity and a capability, because then there's a potential threat. That means that all we need is for someone to decide that they want to couple that capability and that opportunity and harm someone's network. And we know there are a lot of bad guys out there on the internet. We know there's a lot of criminal organizations and nation states and hacktivists who spend their time coming up with ways to carry out their operations against networks. So that intent will probably come. If we have an intent and an opportunity, but there's no capability yet, we have an impending threat, because we know that they're probably spending their time developing that capability. And what we found over the research we've been doing over the past couple years on vulnerabilities and how long it takes that vulnerability to have a corresponding exploit is getting shorter and shorter. So those impending threats, we're just waiting for someone to develop a capability. Now, where I like to see things, if I have to have something on the threat spectrum, if there is an intent and a capability, but there's no opportunity, then it is an insubstantial threat. Because even though they really want to hack us, even though they have some pretty cool tools that will allow them to do that, there's no opportunity. We haven't provided them a way to use that capability against us. Right now, we are dealing with the WannaCry, the Ransom Worm. And that was something that we saw coming, because we had an opportunity that we realized, we just found out very recently, but that opportunity had existed for a very long time. And the SMB version 1 and version 2 in some cases flaw. So that opportunity existed, and there was a capability against it. Initially, that capability was only used by one actor in what we are assuming were limited circumstances based off the information that we have. And that intent was national defense, potentially some espionage-related activity. But so that threat existed, even though we didn't really know about it. But when all that information became public, not only about the opportunity, but also the capability, we had that potential threat. We had any number of potential threats, and all it did was depend on that intent. And so we saw, as we saw on Friday, somebody's intent was, dollar bills, y'all. Somebody wanted to make some money. So they coupled this capability that had been leaked with some ransomware and ran rampant across networks all over the world. I think it probably got a little bigger than they thought. They're having some issues managing this right now. But that intent was there, and all we had to do was watch out, and it turned that potential threat into a true threat. And it's not the end of it. There are all sorts of intents that people could have. Somebody could want to destroy systems. Somebody could want to cause chaos. Maybe somebody else wants to make money in a different way. There are an infinite number of potential threats out there. And so what we need to do is focus on how do we get rid of that opportunity. The capability is not going away. The more we secure our systems, the easier it is to kind of limit and identify those capabilities. But this is a situation where we really need to focus on the opportunity that we're presenting. So when we get together with our friends in security and we talk about this, we just slap our heads and we say, how could anybody let this opportunity exist? Why didn't they patch? This is so crazy. And we don't think about how we're conveying that message. If all we're saying is, why didn't you patch? You're all so dumb. That isn't telling the story. That isn't saying why this is important. This isn't saying why it happened or what could potentially happen. And so all we're doing is shouting technical details at folks who don't understand what we're trying to say. So threat intelligence gives us the opportunity to be much better at telling our story, helping people make decisions, and hopefully seeing positive change. So, analyzed information about intense opportunities and capabilities. What does that look like? What does analyzing information mean? Where does this information even come from? A lot of times it comes from things like this. This is a output from a honey net that we run at Rapid7 that looks for all sorts of fun stuff. This is data. This is the very raw, most basic raw format of like building blocks that are going to create threat intelligence. Right now, this isn't telling me much. I could kind of look through and maybe see some IP addresses in there, but I don't even know if that's the IP of my honeypot or the IP of someone who's interacting with it. And I don't know what it's telling me. To get data to information, it has to go through some form of processing. You have to say, okay, what is this data saying? And that's how it becomes information. I'm lucky, I have a team of data scientists who do awesome things like this for me. They take all that honey net output and say, okay, what this is telling us based on what we were looking for was all of the Mirai botnet. We did some research at the end of last year on the Mirai botnet that attacked that was using the IoT devices to conduct denial of service attacks. So we were able to see, all right, these are the different net blocks and the activity that we're seeing from Mirai. So now this is information. This is a fact. We know that we saw on these days this amount of traffic from these different networks, but it still isn't intelligence. Intelligence requires asking questions of this data, of pulling in other sources of information that we talked about at the beginning, and figuring out what does this data mean. Data collection, data analysis, that data processing, that is the science part of threat intelligence. Analysis is the art. Asking questions, making assessments. I could say, okay, why did we see this dip, this huge dip across the board right there? What caused that? We could say, well, why is this blue line here that was related to Comcast, why is that higher than everything else? I want to understand. Does that tell me something about how the attackers targeted? Does it tell us something about the opportunity they created or maybe about their intent? That information, once we analyze it, will never be a fact. I can never say with 100% certainty, this drop is because somebody posted a blog talking about the Mirai botnet and people realized that they needed to do something. I can assess that that's probably true based on my analysis, but that will not be a fact. And that's something we need to be better at saying with threat intelligence. These are our assessments. Our assessments are important. The stories that this information is telling us are important, but they are still just that. They are assessments. But we still need to go through some sort of process to generate these assessments. I've been dealing with a lot of conflicting information about the WannaCry Ransom Worm, because people make these assessments and they throw information out there as if they're facts. And they don't tell people how they came to their analysis. They don't tell people what it's based off of. They don't say their confidence level. They just throw things out as if they're facts, and then the audience, the people who receive those, they have to respond to them as if they're facts. And when they're conflicting, we have problems. So how do we get from asking a question of a data set to coming to an analysis, to making an assessment that we can convey with some amount of certainty to an audience? And that is the analytic process. Now, my typical method of explaining analysis, when people would say, yes, we get it, that's great, analyze the data, make our assessments, that's cool, how do we do it? I used to throw my shoe at them and run away because it's a really, really hard thing to understand. But I realized after a while that probably wasn't the best response. I wasn't really helping people understand analysis, and I lost a lot of shoes. So I came up with this graph, and the goal of it was to help people understand what is this process I should go through. So you start with your question. You have to ask a question of your data. You can ask multiple questions, but do them one at a time. If you ask 5 questions and try and analyze things all at once, you're going to confuse yourself. The next step is to review information. So if you need to be able to pull additional details either out of your original data set or start going to other sources, maybe what else is going on in the world during the time period of this data that I'm analyzing? What was going on at our organization or our company? And then from that information, you develop your hypothesis. Now, typically, when we follow the scientific process, after you have your hypothesis, you test it. And depending on how many variables there are after your test, you're going to have an answer. Yes, this hypothesis is correct. No, it's not. Unfortunately, it's not that easy with structured intelligence analysis because, as I said, we're not dealing with facts. We're generating assessments at this point. So what we need to do is evaluate our assumptions. Assumptions are the things that we use to create our hypothesis. Some of these are based off of experiences we've had. Some of these are based off of how we understand how the internet works. And if I see this activity, it means this. But understanding your assumptions and how you're coming to that analysis of your hypothesis is important. You need to understand, is my entire hypothesis, is the reason I believe this is true based off of one single piece of evidence? If it is, I probably need to be really, really confident in that piece of evidence and in the assumptions I made about it. The next step is to go to your analytic judgment. And this is not a yes, no. This is a thought process that you go through. You can use models like the analysis of competing hypothesis. You can use models like the kill chain or the diamond model to step through your evidence and logically lay it out. But you have to go through and follow some sort of analytic process in order to say, yes, my hypothesis is likely to be correct, or it is not likely, because again, it's not yes or no. Now, if your hypothesis was likely to be correct, awesome, good job, you're not done yet. You need to assign a confidence to it. You need to say, yes, I am like 90% certain there is almost no way this is wrong. Or you can say, okay, all signs point towards this, but if I had this additional information, I would know more. So you assign that confidence, you identify anything that might change your analysis, and then you record your results. Now, if through the course of your evaluating your assumptions and your analytic judgment, you realize that, okay, this is probably not the right path, that is okay too. We've come up with some pretty crazy off-the-wall theories about this WannaCry Ransom Worm. And we still step them through the process, because if nothing else, it makes me know that my mind is working, that I'm thinking about things correctly, and I'm not just automatically assuming any random thought that pops into my head is intelligence. So if something is not likely, that is great. It means your process is working. Still record the results, because I guarantee someone else is going to have that same crazy hypothesis that you had, and you can save them the trouble of having to go through everything themselves by being able to say, aha, I see where what evidence they had that countered my thoughts. And then you go right back up and you develop a new hypothesis. So this kind of lengthy process should go into every serious piece of threat intelligence that you're developing. If something is important, you need to make the time to go through this entire process. Luckily, you don't have to do it every time you see a bad IP address, every time you see a strange-looking domain. There are shortcuts and there are ways to handle some of those lower-level technical indicators. But if you're trying to answer a big question, like who is behind this campaign, or why did they target this particular organization, to get the answer, to be able to tell the right story, the correct story that's going to help people make decisions, you need to go through this analytic process. This process ends up following what we call the intelligence process. And there are lots of different ways to look at it, lots of different models. Some of them have 5 steps, some of them have 6. The core of that intelligence analysis is collect, analyze, and inform. There are some other steps that go into this as well. Direction. You have to know what you're collecting and why you're analyzing it, what questions you're trying to answer. Where you collect, how you analyze, and how you're going to inform are based off of that direction. And then someone also has to act. We don't just generate intelligence so that way we better understand what's going on. We want to be able to have someone and help people act on that, whether that is making decisions to block a certain IP range or making decisions about how to re-architect their network to protect against certain significant threats. Someone has to act, and that is another factor that's going to contribute to how you analyze this information. One example is if your requirements, the question you're trying to answer is who is behind this attack, because the anticipated action is going to be to take some sort of legal action, then you're going to approach the problem in one way. You're going to focus on indicators that might lead you to the actors behind it. Maybe do some looking through dark web forums, see who's been talking about maybe your organization. We actually see this a lot, not about network intrusions, but about things like brand protection, because there are actual legal things in place to deal with those. And so if that is your goal, then you are going to take kind of one sort of process. Now, a direction we see much more common is I want to be able to identify behaviors. What does this attack look like against my network? Because the action is going to be to put some sort of technical measures in place to detect or prevent that activity. So if that is your goal, if that is your direction and that's going to be your action, you're going to approach it much differently. You don't care about who, you don't care about where their desk is or who's giving them orders. You want to know what that attack looks like. What am I going to see and how am I going to know if I'm targeted so I can take technical actions? So those are two other additional steps that often, if you're the one conducting analysis, they're outside of your control. If you're the one who's directing and you're the one who's making decisions, these are going to be in your control. So make sure that you are providing your people with as good direction as you possibly can so they can give you what you need. So just like there are different types of directions and actions that can be taken in response to threat intelligence, there are different places that you can use threat intelligence. And it needs to be handled differently. Robert M. Lee, my co-author for the SANS Cyber Threat Intelligence course, he and I used to have these arguments about analytic models. There's one he loved. I had tried it. I hated it. It took too long. It didn't provide me the information I needed. And we would butt heads. I'm like, this is a terrible model. And he would say, what are you talking about? This is the best model that has ever existed. I use it every single investigation that I do. And I said, wait a second. Investigation? Like, what are you talking about? He said, incident response, and when I'm doing my investigations. I was like, oh, yeah, I was trying to use it for triage in my SOC, and it's terrible. And we realized, depending on what you were doing, you're going to use different processes and different models. So it's important to understand how your intelligence is going to be used. So I'm going to go through kind of the difference between a SOC setting, a detection, a prevention and detection, and an investigation sense as to how you use threat intelligence. So the goal with threat intelligence in a SOC is to build better detections. You have these capabilities, you have systems in place that can identify malicious activity on your network, and the goal of threat intelligence is to help the people who are responding to those alert on things better, faster, and understand what to do once you see them. So when you're trying to build detections based off threat intelligence, the three primary questions you ask are, should I alert on this? Can I alert on this? And then what exactly is this? Now, should we act on this? The number one question when I receive a piece of intelligence, whether it's from an information sharing organization or a vendor or a partner, is when is this from? Because the timing is going to dictate whether I detect on it or whether I kick it over to the incident response team to look at it. If it was activity from 6 months ago and it's related to a targeted attack, alerting on it from now to the future might not be the best idea. You're probably not going to see a lot. But if it's an attack that's ongoing, like our Ransom Worm, then absolutely, let's build detections based on it. The next question is, who's being targeted? There's a lot of intelligence out there that talks about very specific targeted attacks. Journalists in Ukraine are being targeted. If you're not a journalist in Ukraine, it's probably good to understand that this threat exists, especially if it's a newly public capability. But you're not going to want to build detections on those specific indicators related to the campaign that is targeting Ukrainian journalists. You're going to waste your time, you're going to clog your systems, you're going to potentially generate a lot of false positives. So understanding whether or not this threat is relevant to you can help you decide whether or not you need to act on it at all. And then the last one is this even applicable to us? Do we use these systems that are being targeted? A lot of times when we're talking about technical vulnerabilities, even if it's something like a spear phishing email that is going to drop a PDF that has malware embedded in it, it relies on exploiting technical vulnerabilities. So when we understand what those vulnerabilities target, we can see whether or not we use those systems. Probably the person who is having the best time right now in information security, is my buddy Scott, who does incident response for GitHub. And that is because GitHub is exclusively an OS X shop. I know this because he's done a lot of talks talking about how difficult it is to do this detection and response in a Mac environment. He has to use open source tools like OS Query. But guess who isn't being targeted by the WannaCry Ransom Worm? GitHub. So if he were to see all of this intelligence, all this information out there on this threat that targets Windows environments, and spend all of his time over the weekend, not sleep, it's not going to do a single bit of good for his network because they do not have the systems that are vulnerable to this attack. So this goes back to understanding our capability, opportunity, and intent of actors. He probably has some different things to look at. He probably needs to say, okay, what would it take for this capability to impact my systems? And let me look for that, rather than focusing on this threat that isn't going to impact me. So the next question is, okay, if you've determined that yes, we should, this is a threat that's impacting us, can we actually do anything about it? I know a lot of organizations who spend a lot of money on like threat intelligence feeds that will automatically throw hashes of malicious of malware over to their systems. And if they don't have endpoint visibility, those hashes are actually not doing any good. So if all you have are hashes and you don't have endpoint visibility, even if you should act on this, you can't. That is a limitation of your security program. And things like that should be documented. So you can say, hey, we keep getting hit by these threats. We have the intelligence that could help us, but we cannot act on it. And that's how you use threat intelligence to build the case for a better security measures that you need that are going to support you. You might have policies in place about exactly what you're allowed to do. Are you allowed to monitor user traffic? Do you have privacy issues around that? Do you have the authority to act on something? If you do identify that there is a worm spreading through your network and you need to pull the plug in order to stop it, can you actually do that? And if the answer to these questions is no, you're back to making your case of why you need that information, why you need that authority, why you need these policy changes. And threat intelligence is going to arm you with that information. So you're not just saying, but I need it. You can clearly state this is why it's important. And then, if you know, yes, we should alert on this, and yes, we can alert on this, the next thing that you should do is say, okay, what exactly is this? And I don't want to just say like, oh, it's a bad thing on the internet, because that isn't actually helping anybody. That isn't providing anybody any sort of information. You need to be able to identify not just the technical details, like we have here along the kill chain. Okay, this is a spear phishing email that is going to drop this file, that's going to start this process, that's going to exploit these vulnerabilities and steal all of our data. I used to have, instead of actions, I used to have it say all is lost, but I figured that was kind of too negative, so we just, whatever they're gonna do. But you also need to understand, what is this threat related to? Is this a targeted espionage threat where we think they're after our intellectual property? Or is this someone looking for credit card details? Being able to provide all of this information and this level of intelligence to a SOC analyst, to somebody who is trying to go through and triage a lot of alerts, that's going to help them understand, what do I need to do and how do I respond? When I talked about Rob and I arguing about the difference between SOC and incident response, it comes down to time. When I'm doing an investigation into an intrusion, I have some time. I'm digging through logs. I can go through that lengthy analysis process right then to understand what's going on. When I'm a security operations analyst and I have 50 alerts, I don't have time to do that. I need to know now what's going on. And so that's the work of threat intelligence, is to provide them that information. I have to do the work. Threat intelligence teams have to do that work and that analysis and build it into the detections. That way the analyst can get through their OODA loop. So the OODA loop was a concept invented by John Boyd, who was a fighter pilot. And it came down to, it doesn't matter whether your enemy has a better airplane. It doesn't matter if they have better equipment. If you can get through this thought process faster than they can, you're going to win. And that is observe, orient, decide, and act. So threat intelligence sits right here in this orient and decide. When an alert pops up, when we have that visibility and we can observe that activity, The next thing that needs to happen is I need to know why this is important and what I need to do about it. So providing information on, yes, this is ransomware. Yes, this is a targeted intrusion. Yes, this is related to this malware family. And you should also see these things and take these actions. When I can provide that to my SOC analysts, they are able to move through this whole process very quickly. When I don't do that, when they observe something and they have no idea why it's important, except that, hey, Rebekah put it in there, so clearly we should care about it, I'm actually making it harder for them to go through this process. They're having to now open up and go to their other tools. They're having to type in IP addresses. They're having to try and figure out why I thought this was bad. So my goal is to always make this process easier and not harder. And if I'm making it harder, I'm not doing my job. So the next case is incident response, which is handled very differently. Incident response is not about that quick reaction. It's not about do this now. When you end up doing those knee-jerk reactions in incident response, you're usually making a mistake. You need to take time to fully understand what's going on before you start taking actions and start throwing information out to people. So incident response support, that looks like things like if you find network indicators, you find IP addresses, command and control IP addresses, you want to do some research and understand, okay, what threat is this related to? Where have I seen this before? Is this a common threat? Is this new? Is this targeted? It can also mean that you're looking for additional things on a network that might help you understand the threat. You could take a command and control address and do some research and figure out, okay, this is how it usually communicates. Let's go look for that traffic. And then the final thing, and this is kind of always my goal when I'm helping incident response, as much as I love helping out with technical details, I really, really like being able to understand that intent piece, the attacker's goals and motivations. Because it's not very likely that we're going to be able to completely reduce the capability and opportunities of that threat actor, but if we know what they're after, if we know they're looking for credit card information or proprietary information that my company holds, you can better protect and you can better identify those capabilities and opportunities based off of their intent. So one of the differences between security operations and incident response, and this is what kind of makes a lot of the more analytic models better conducive to incident response, are the fact that incident response actually generates a lot of intelligence. A lot of the reports you read from vendors who they step through, this attacker and this is what they're after and these are all the steps that they take and how they operate, was based off of incident response. So as they work with the incident response team, or as they are part of the incident response team, they are pulling pieces of intelligence out and doing that analysis, running through that analytic process and taking data to intelligence. So as much as threat intelligence supports incident response is also a critical part of threat intelligence because it helps us understand adversaries. One of the best uses for incident response is actually learning from our mistakes, or if we're fortunate, learning from somebody else's mistakes. A lot of times we have to see an attack, we have to know what's happening in order to properly act on it. And if we're not doing that, if we're not learning from our own incidents, finding things like, okay, what information was targeted? How did they get in? How did they move through our network? Then it's very likely that we're going to see the exact same attack or very similar attack in the future. So making sure that you are learning is a critical component of incident response. That's that action. You want to make some changes to your network. You want to remediate any vulnerabilities. You want to do user awareness if it was social engineering that allowed that attacker to target your network. But you should always take some action based off of that analysis you're doing. When I first started studying cyber threat intelligence, like I said, I was a Chinese crypto linguist, and they said, go learn everything about network warfare. One of the first books I read was The Cuckoo's Egg by Cliff Stoll. And if you haven't read it, please go do it. It's a fantastic, fantastic story, and it's a true story. And it was one of the first cases of cyber espionage that was recorded. And it was the Russians going through a University of Berkeley computer system back when the internet was very small, back in the 80s, to get things like the White Sands missile test facility data or target other military and government targets because of that trust relationship. And Cliff Stoll was the systems administrator back then. He was a physicist, I believe. And he didn't have everything we have today. There was no Wireshark. There was no domain tools or passive total to provide him information. He had to improvise. He had to do things like go borrow his coworkers' printers and plug them in to his switch to monitor traffic that were going across those lines. That was like the first version of packet capture. But he said this quote. He spoke at the Cyber Threat Intelligence Summit this January. And he talked about what he was going through and how he was able to be successful in that case. And he said, so what do you do when you're broke, you feel stupid, and you're discouraged? You come up with creative solutions. I have worked in large Fortune 500 companies who had unlimited budgets. I've worked for state and local organizations who my office was like a converted jail cell. I don't know if they were trying to tell me something. But I've worked this wide range of budgets and support and capabilities. But what I found is no matter where you are, that ability to come up with creative solutions, that ability to figure out what works best for you, what tools are out there, what other people have struggled with and have created these tools, that's going to be what actually allows you to succeed. It's not buying an threat intelligence feed. It's not coming up with a relationship with a vendor who's going to provide you a report. Those things are all useful. Those things are all pieces that are going to contribute to your understanding of the threat. But you need to be able to know how to go through and get information, get the right information, and analyze it to meet your needs. And so that is kind of what led me to create my own version of Cliff Stoll's wiretapping, which is the Frugal Girl's Guide to Threat Intelligence. Ideally, you would be able to know before you started spending a single dime, because threat intelligence can be expensive. I'm not sure if any of you have talked to vendors or purchased threat intelligence feeds or subscriptions. It is not cheap because a lot of work goes into it. But you don't always have the ability to just buy those. And even if you did, you wouldn't really know what to start with. So the three main reasons to take this frugal approach to threat intelligence are first, necessity. It's just not an option. You do not have the budget, but you still need to help people make these decisions. The next is sustainability. Even if you do have budget now, you can't spend it on things that aren't going to actually give you a well-rounded program. You need to be able to go through and figure out what do I need, what do I have, and what do I need more of, so you can properly spend that money that you have. And then the last one is doing things right. I worked at a company where my first day in the door, they were like, "You're welcome. We just spent $2 million on this thing for you." And I said, "Hey, that's cool, but I don't actually need that." And so doing things right, if you walk through the process of using things like open source tools, using things like public data feeds, and saying, okay, this is working for me, this isn't, I need more of this, I'm willing to pay for this, then you will actually set your program up to be successful. The very first thing that people spend money on that I will say just like stop, just don't do it yet, take some time, is threat feeds. Threat feeds give us that data. Remember the picture of my honeypot data? A lot of times companies will have their own honeypots. They'll be running lots of different detection systems, and they will just pull out all the network indicators and kind of throw them into a system. So this is an example of the firehole level 1. And as you can see right here, when I ran this query, it had almost 660 million IP addresses. Do you have any idea what would happen to your security systems if you plugged in 660 million IP addresses? People would not like you. That is what has happened. I might have done that once myself just to see. It was a really bad day. So while threat feeds are important, this is not the way. The more is better approach is not the way. I like to take a more refined approach. I like to know where my information is coming from. So one of the great things about Firehole is it actually provides you an analysis of what this threat feed is. So for an example, these two, Bot Scout 1 Day, means that it is information on bots that kind of go through and do automated registrations on different web portals. A lot of companies have issues with bots. And so if that was something you're dealing with and you want to analyze those, this would be a good feed to use. And you also know that it's from like the past 24 hours, so it's not old data, it's new relevant information. And another example is this block list for Apache. So this is IP addresses within the last 48 hours that have been attacking Apache servers. So again, if you have these Apache servers and that's a threat you're worried about, absolutely, this feed is for you. If you don't, you probably don't need to be worried about it. Another thing Firehole provides, is this kind of analytic information about what is in this feed. I really like to know about my data sources. I like to know what I'm pulling into my system, what I'm trusting, what I'm basing my analysis off of. So as opposed to that 660 million IP addresses, this one's sitting at about 900. I feel like I can probably handle 900 IP addresses, especially if I know it's related to a threat that I care about. Some other important information. Unique IPs, and then how often it's updated. 33 minutes is good. I am happy with this. I would use this feed as a data source for my analysis. And what's more is rather than once you start looking through these data feeds and once you start saying, yes, Apache, awesome, I care about that. Bots, no, I don't care about that. I don't have any web applications. You can start mapping out what it is you need. What do you need information off of? And then figure out where can I get that? Are there publicly available feeds that I can use? And if so, where are they? And you can also look for gaps. If something I want is historical whois information, and all these up on the top are all of the open source feeds, all the community feeds I have access to, and none of them are providing me that, I know it's okay to dip down the line to the commercial feeds and find something that's going to meet that need, because I know I need it and I know I can't get it anywhere else. The threat intelligence quotient test is a cool tool. There's a couple tools I'm going to talk about that were built by the MLSec project. And those are all to help you better deal with threat intelligence. The TIQ test will do some data science magic, which I wish I understood better, but like I said, I have a team of data scientists who help me with that. But it will go through and analyze all your feeds and tell you things like, how unique are they? Are two feeds that you're pulling in actually providing the exact same information? And if so, do you really need both of them? It can provide things like how often are things added versus kind of taken away. So if all you have is a feed that the number just keeps going up and up and up and up and they're not ever retiring anything, that's probably not a good feed to use. But this is available on GitHub, MLSec project, TIQ test. And that can help you if you already have feeds. And you can do this against commercial feeds as well, your own, or internal data sources to figure out whether you're getting the right data that you need. Another question I get is, how do I know what standard to use? Do I use Stix Taxi? Do I use IODEF? Do I use, Excel files? And the problem is we have a lot of different ways and a lot of different standards that we use to store our information. So another tool that I think is great is called Combine, and is a second tool that the MLSec project put together. And it will take all of your data in all of its different formats and different data standards, and it will actually put them into a usable format for you. If you need JSON output, it can do JSON output. If you want Stix, it can do Stix. And it also works with some other threat intelligence platforms that are out there, including one called CRITS. So CRITS is the collaborative research into threats. It was originally created as a malware repository, and it is free. It involves some work. I like to say open source tools are free as in puppies, meaning, yeah, maybe you get a puppy for free, but you are not responsible for caring and feeding and cleaning up after that puppy for the rest of its life. So when you use things like CRITS, make sure that you know that you're going to have to have somebody who can stand up the server and maintain it and support it. But it is a really good way to pull in lots of information and start processing that data to get it into a way that you can do your analysis. So CRITS is available also on GitHub. And then Yeti. So CRITS was originally malware-based. Yeti was just released earlier this year, and it is probably one of the first open source threat intelligence platforms I've seen that is really geared towards an analyst. So it provides things like automated enrichment of indicators. It will do up-to-date information on the different things you're seeing. It will help you put into a nice little graph if you like graphs. I'm a visual person, so this works well for me. But so Yeti is another good tool that you can use. And then there are also ways to investigate IOCs. Passive Total is a good one I like. It provides information if you're dealing with technical indicators on tags, whereas it's been seen before. You can pull information out pretty easily. Right here, I can see that this particular IP was associated with brute force logins against Apache. So right now, when we're talking about that context and providing your security operations center with ways to handle things, this will give you the information that you need. You can do some other investigations using passive total about how often is this domain seen? Is it brand new? If it's a domain that was stood up like 5 minutes ago, do people in your company really need to be going to it? Like maybe you have great trendsetters, like early adopters in your organization, but if you don't, they probably don't need to be going to that new domain. It's most likely malicious. So this can provide you some information as to the time length of domains as well. And then you can also pull up open source information about things like hashes and where it's been seen and what threats it's related to. And this allows you to pivot really easily into other open source tools, such as VirusTotal. Here we go. So VirusTotal can provide information to you on things like how many different organizations are detecting this threat. It can provide information on potentially what it is, just based off the naming conventions. We're really, really terrible with standardized namings of malware that we've seen. But that's okay, because you can still pull enough information out of this result list to understand that you're probably dealing with some sort of Trojan. And then from there, you can do more open source research. Things like blogs. A lot of the antivirus vendors will provide more information on what they've deemed that Trojan to be. And that can actually provide you to build that context, build that picture of what is this threat, should I care about it, should I alert on it. What I've found are that there are many threat intelligence vendors who focus on that really sophisticated nation-state espionage activity, when a lot of organizations are actually dealing with ransomware and Trojans and credit card scraping. And I found that blogs actually provide a lot of information on that type of criminal threat. And they're a really good place to go to get that intelligence without having to pay an arm and a leg for it. Another good one I like to use is ThreatCrowd. ThreatCrowd pulls its data from a couple other sources, malware.com and VirusTotal as well. So if you're already going to VirusTotal, you will see a lot of the same information here. But it also provides crowdsourced, and it also allows people a place to provide their comments. Yes, I analyzed this file. This is what I saw. Yes, this was good. Yes, this was bad. And they'll do some of that mapping for you as well, so you can start developing relationships between indicators. Individual indicators are not my favorite thing in the world, but when you start chaining them together and understanding the relationships between them, they become a lot more useful. Threat Miner is another one. There's a lot of threat sites out there. You probably just Google like threat website and you'll find whatever new one has popped up. But I really like Threat Miner. It pulls from a lot of different sources as well. You might have picked up on I really care about where my intelligence is coming from. I really like knowing my sources. Hopefully you will as well. But in addition to investigating individual indicators of compromise, those technical details, it also pulls from a repository called Apt Notes, which is a repository of all of these long-form vendor reports on different threats. And you can search that way. For example, if you're in the manufacturing industry and you want to understand what threats are impacting me, who has targeted my sector before, you can search here and be provided with a list of different reports you can look for. I really like Apt Notes for that. And then once you've gone through, there's a lot of different ways that you can do this research, a lot of ways you can conduct analysis, whether it's from threat feeds or using some of these online repositories to build a picture of the threat. You need to tell people about it. Threat intelligence allows us to tell the story of an attack, of an actor, to help make it more, help our customers, whether they are our end users or our management, better understand the threats that are facing us and what decisions they need to make. But that's not going to happen unless we actually tell the story in a way that's going to help them respond. I love this Dilbert quote, because this is what we end up seeing right now. And the gist of it is, do you want the technical report you won't understand or the executive summary that's dangerously misleading? And that's often what we have to choose from, and I don't think we should have to do that. We should be able to convey technical information in a way that makes sense, and we should be able to generate executive summaries that are accurate and are not going to just be designed at scaring our executives. One of the ways I like to do this, especially related to incident response, is using a tool called Office Timeline. And I spent a really long time, I have to use PowerPoint, and finding a way to convey an attack timeline and what happened it was really hard for me. So this was a tool, when I found it, I loved it. It was for like project management, but I kind of tweaked it to make it work for incident response. And you can break down across a timeline different important actions, brute force login attempts, access using stolen credentials, and you can map it to the different phases of the kill chain to help convey, okay, here's where things went wrong. We were doing great up until here. We could look back in the logs and see the attacker was trying to get in and they were not able to until they found a password dump where an employee had reused their personal credentials of their work account and they were able to get in access. Another way to tell that same story is using a kill chain. So you can talk about, okay, here was the exploitation vector. You can say, allowing employees to reuse passwords, not having two-factor authentication, allowing this development server with no security to be on the open internet. This is what's caused us to be impacted, or this is what is going to cause us to be impacted. And then rather than just walking around and saying like, God, why would you ever do that? You're so dumb. You're actually able to say, this is why this is important, and this is why we need to change things. One of my favorite quotes about conveying information is this. There are two ways to share knowledge. You can push information out, or you can draw people in with story. What we tend to do in security is we push information out, and it's not always the right information. We throw information at people in a way that they can't digest it, in a way that they don't understand, and then get frustrated when they don't actually take the actions that we wanted them to. A much better approach is to connect with the people we are supporting, because that's what we do in security. We support other people. We make it able for them to do their jobs, for businesses to succeed, for users to be secure and have their personal information secure. They are part of this with us. So if we can take everything we've learned about a threat, if we can take all this threat intelligence we've developed, and we can craft it in a way that we can convey and connect with people and say, this is a big deal, this is serious, and we need to work together to solve this. That's the only way we're going to be able to protect our networks in any sort of lasting way. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for letting me be here. I think I might have run a tad bit over. But if I have any questions, you can either find me afterwards. I'll be around for the next few days. And thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Jessie. No, we've got plenty of time.
Oh, perfect.
Which means you're on the spot for a few minutes.
Awesome. Who has questions?
Who has any questions?
I love questions.
And do we have roving mics at the back? Because about 10 minutes ago we didn't. So let's hope we do now. Who's got any questions for Rebekah? Yes, sir, over there. Can we get a microphone to that gentleman?
Just going back to WANA, there's been allegations in the intelligence sectors that North Korea was behind it. Your thoughts on that?
So, since those came out yesterday and I had to sleep at some point, I'm a little jet lagged. I haven't gotten to look into the technical details and how they've made that connection. And full disclosure, I have biases around this because I did do a lot of investigation and a lot of work with things like the Sony case. My very first impressions would be that I don't think the North Koreans would use a ransomware cover. I think that a lot of the code, the method that they use to do the worming, might align with some of their tactics. I don't know why they would have thrown the ransomware aspect into that. I think that is kind of a... When I talk about going through your analytic judgment process, one of the methods I use is analysis of competing hypotheses. So in this case, one of my pieces of evidence would be that this was a ransomware campaign designed to get money. And that would counter my hypothesis that it was North Korea, because those things don't line up. I would need to do a lot more research could this potentially have been a false flag? Could this have been something to throw us off? Again, those don't normally seem like a tactic of North Korea, but I would need to do a lot more analysis and look at the technical details. It is very difficult to make attribution based off of code that was used, especially if that code is already public, because it is very easy for someone to snap that off the internet and build it into whatever their toolkit is. So I would want to make sure that the evidence that that analysis was based on was not simply code reuse, because we know that that is not a good assumption to make. So I know that was a terrible, I'm like doing analysis on the fly right here, but I think we need a lot more time to look into those connections. All right, basically any question has to be easier after that, so anyone?
Rebekah, do you think that, I didn't see a hand over there. We'll get you, whoever that was, in a minute. Do you think that state actors, and I'm talking specifically about Western state actors,
Yes.
the US and European actors, are they making the threat landscape worse, as we saw with this WannaCry thing, or is there a net benefit to their cyber defense programs?
So I think there's another one. When I said there couldn't be a more difficult question, I think this is it. I think there are benefits. Nations need to protect themselves. And what we're seeing more and more since when I first started doing this job in 2005 is that the methods are shifting. Adversaries are using cyber attacks as a way to further their goals. So nations need a way to understand and identify what's going on. I think that is just the way the world works. And I don't think we can go back. Just like we can't say that people shouldn't do analysis, whether it's based on open source information or kind of surreptitiously gained information. We can't tell nations that they're not going to be able to do that to protect themselves because they'll just be like, yeah, cool, we totally get you, and go back to doing what they're going to do.
So just like police need guns, and even if those guns get stolen.
Exactly. But we do need to get better. We need to learn lessons from this. Mm-hmm. We can definitely say, okay, there has to be some sort of limit to when we will step in and really take good action to protect ourselves. So I think there are a lot of different ways we can learn, and we're seeing more and more capabilities get out there, whether it's through leaks, and we've had a lot of leaks lately, or whether it's just from analysis of an actual attack and doing the reverse engineering on a piece of malware. That's going to provide information on a capability. All the information is out there, and what I take from a defensive perspective is that we need to get better at identifying these things and quickly responding and putting things in place and getting the message out as to why we need to protect ourselves.
And just as a follow-up, do you think that these leaks are a great benefit to companies out there? I mean, I would imagine that it's a secret thing that the NSA is hoarding or GSHQ is hoarding. Well, if they've got it, the Russians probably also have it.
Absolutely. So this is another case where I think if we were better at defense, and this would absolutely be a net benefit. Mm-hmm. The fact that I now know about vulnerabilities and capabilities that one sophisticated actor could use means that I do know more about how other sophisticated actors are probably approaching things. I work for Rapid7 and we make Metasploit. So we are very much of the mindset that sunshine is the best disinfectant. Yeah. If I can know what an attacker is using and if I can figure out and make sure that I'm either protected from that or can detect it, then I'm going to be in a better position defensively than if everything stayed secret and we didn't know about this kind of under the radar attacks that were going on. But again, that relies on us being good defenders and utilizing that information when it appears.
Okay, there was a question over there somewhere. I've got lots of lights in my eyes. So.
Who's over there? Yep.
Yes, sir.
Yes, it has been answered now. You have answered my question already, so I will not repeat it. You have answered now my question.
The question has already been answered.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Perfect. Yes.
A couple, if that's okay.
I can't see where you at. Raise a hand.
So
right at the back.
Right at the
Okay.
back. So if you were going to say what your top 3 tips are to protect against a ransomware attack and the kind of damage that it could do, what would those be? Secondly, you talked about how important it is to tell stories, because often content can be alienating because it's too technical. Perhaps just some tips on how to communicate effectively with people who hold the budget about how seriously the threat needs to be taken. And finally, if you'll allow, in your assessment, you have a global view. How vulnerable is Africa in the sense of the capability that it's developed to defend itself, And the follow-on then obviously is, not to be unfair, what is your assessment of the South African landscape? Thank you.
So the first one, ransomware. I think that one of the top things is user awareness. So we've seen a lot of ransomware in general, not this particular WannaCry, but in general it's being spread via things like phishing emails or malicious links. And so helping people understand typical tactics that attackers use to try and lure them in and social engineer them is important. Like I said, they do all rely on some sort of a technical vulnerability. So making sure that your systems are patched against those vulnerabilities is very important, especially with the WannaCry worm. We know that there are patches out there. We know patching isn't always easy, especially to do it quickly. But this is one of those times I would say, get in your war room, figure out what needs to be done and how you need to do it, because it's probably not going away. And then for what we've seen as far as how ransomware spreads within networks, network segmentation is really important. This particular WannaCry one kind of exploits trusts and shares between devices. But I've also seen times where somebody would get a piece of ransomware, and due to the way the network was configured, it would automatically sync that file to like a shared drive, and then anybody else who accessed the shared drive would now be infected. So that's one of those cases where our policies and the things that our networks do are actually hurting us. So identifying times when things have gone bad and making sure that your networks will not kind of fall victim to those same methods of malware propagating throughout networks is important. Second question. I can't remember what that was. What was the second one?
How seriously should you take those threats?
Yes. And how to convey that information. So I love data. I said in my introduction, I think I skipped over it, but it's on the slide if you look back, that I'm a data and research nerd. And I think that anytime I need to especially talk to somebody who's non-technical or who is in charge of my money or my budget or making big decisions, I have to have data to back it up that's relatable to them. So one of the things I like to do is to use a model that the Verizon, the DBIR uses, the Data Breach Investigations Report, called Veris. And it captures high-level details about attacks. How did they happen? What was impacted? What was the effect? And a lot of times there's actually, when you talk about what was that effect, people will provide information on either it took us 6 months to remediate or it cost us $2 billion or $2 million to remediate. Being able to gather information like that and do some analysis and say, hey, all these organizations who had this happen to them, they fit our same profile. Or if you can track your own internal incidents, when I talked about incident response and how important it is to learn from what has happened to us, you can track that same level of information about your own incidents. And that way, when you go to present your findings, you can say, all right, here is what is our number one threat. We are constantly being impacted by spear phishing emails. That's been 90% of the time, and that's because we don't have spam filters in place. We don't have endpoint protection. We don't have application whitelisting. And because of that, it's cost us 453 days downtime and $275 million. When you present information like that in their language and what they're used to seeing, and it's based off of real data, you're going to make a much more compelling case for change. And you're also going to have, by going through that process, a much better understanding of your own threat. As far as the vulnerability of Africa and of South Africa, I have not myself done a whole lot of research into that, but my data science team is actually getting ready to publish a report called the National Exposure Index. We did one last year. We're wrapping up ours from this year. We have a couple of different research projects we use. One of them is called Project Sonar, where we scan the internet on a weekly basis, looking for lots of different vulnerabilities, looking for common weaknesses, common flaws in systems that are internet facing. And we break that down by region and by country. And so when that comes out, which should be relatively soon, I know they're just wrapping up final details, that'll provide a lot more information on what we're seeing as kind of the footprint of Africa and South Africa in particular.
Okay, well now we are out of time.
Now we're out of time. Thank you all for the great questions.
Thank you very much for your time and for coming halfway around the world to talk to us.
Absolutely.
Fascinating presentation. Rebekah Brown from Rapid 7.